One of the most intriguing questions in the sacred scriptures remains hidden in the first pages of human history, a mystery that has puzzled readers for millennia. If only one man and one woman gave rise to humanity, how did their son find a wife? The enigma of Cain's wife challenges our understanding of humanity's beginnings. The Bible tells us that after committing the first murder in history, Cain left the divine presence and went to the land of Nod. There, the text mentions that he knew his wife. But where did this woman come from, if the narrative only mentioned Adam, Eve, and Cain himself as the only living human beings? Were there other groups of people not mentioned in Scripture? Or could there be another explanation for this apparent paradox? In this account, we'll unravel the layers of this profound mystery that has confused scholars and ordinary readers alike. We'll explore not only the possible origins of Cain's wife, but also how this enigma connects with our understanding of the biblical creation narrative itself. This story offers a perspective on family relationships and the interpretation of sacred scripture that few people know. While some see this enigma as a contradiction, others discover in it a key to understanding the true purpose of origin narratives. Who was the woman who became Cain's wife? Where did she come from in a world apparently inhabited only by her immediate family? And why do the scriptures remain silent about her identity and origin? The answer to these questions reveals much more than a simple genealogical detail. It invites us to reconsider our understanding of the first pages of human history. To understand the enigma of Cain's wife, we need to return to the cradle of humanity, to the primordial garden where the story began. Imagine a place of perfect harmony, like the most beautiful park you've ever visited, but infinitely more pure and vibrant. This was the Garden of Eden, the setting where Adam and Eve lived in direct communion with the divine. The world of that time was radically different from ours. There were no cities, roads, or technology. There were no nations or borders. It was a virgin planet, where the first human family lived in an untouched environment, breathing pure air and drinking crystal-clear water from rivers that had never known pollution. Adam and Eve weren't distant mythical figures, but real people with desires, fears, and curiosities similar to our own. They also faced difficult choices and dealt with the consequences of their decisions, just as we do today. The biblical account tells that after the disobedience in the garden, Adam and Eve were expelled from that paradise. Outside the walls of Eden, they faced a more hostile world where sustenance would come from the sweat of their labor. It was in this new environment that they began to form their family. The text mentions the birth of their first children, Cain and Abel. Cain became a farmer, cultivating the land to produce food. Abel, on the other hand, became a shepherd of sheep. Two brothers following different paths, but still part of the same small family community. The tension between the brothers grew when both presented offerings to God. Abel's offering was accepted, while Cain's was rejected. This difference in treatment kindled bitter jealousy in Cain's heart that eventually led him to commit fratricide, the first murder recorded in human history. After this terrible act, Cain faced the consequences. God confronted him and pronounced judgment. Cain would become a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. The text describes how he went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. It's precisely at this point in the narrative that the mystery arises. The biblical text in Genesis 4:17 says, "Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch." This simple mention raises the big question: who was this woman and where did she come from, if until then the account only mentioned Adam, Eve, Cain, and the deceased Abel? This is the context of the enigma we're exploring. A primordial family in a newly inhabited world, a terrible crime, a man marked by God himself, and a mysterious woman who appears in the narrative without any explanation about her origin. The biblical account of the first days of humanity is surprisingly economical in details. Each word seems chosen with precision, leaving much between the lines. To unravel the mystery of Cain's wife, we need to carefully follow the clues left in the sacred text. After the birth of Cain, the firstborn, the book of Genesis relates, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth." However, before this mention of Seth, the text had already introduced Abel, the second son, without detailing exactly when he was born. This pattern of mentioning only specific births, without listing all descendants, establishes an important precedent for our investigation. The biblical narrative frequently focuses only on the central figures for the historical line it intends to trace, omitting other characters. A crucial detail appears in Genesis 5:4, where the text mentions that the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. This simple phrase reveals something fundamental. Adam and Eve had many other sons and daughters besides the few named in the text. The longevity of the antediluvian patriarchs, where figures like Adam lived hundreds of years, offers another important clue. With such long lives, the reproductive capacity of these first generations would allow significant population growth even in just a few generations. When Cain expresses his fear after being sentenced by God, he says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." This statement suggests that Cain was aware of the existence of other people besides his parents. Who would these people be that Cain feared, if not other descendants of Adam and Eve? Even more intriguing is the mention that God put a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. This mark would only make sense if there were other human beings who might encounter him in his wanderings. After leaving the presence of his parents, Cain departed to the land of Nod. The text then mentions that he knew his wife. The Hebrew word translated as knew is yada, frequently used as a euphemism for marital relations. There is no mention that Cain found a woman from another human group, or that God created a companion for him as he had done for Adam. The most straightforward solution to this enigma, considering all these indications, would be that Cain's wife was his own sister or perhaps a niece, a direct descendant of Adam and Eve. This possibility, although initially disturbing to modern sensibilities, must be understood in the context of those primordial times. It's important to note that the laws against marriage between close relatives were only established much later, during the time of Moses, thousands of years after these events. At the beginning of humanity, such prohibition did not exist because the genetic dangers associated with these relationships were not present in the first human generations. The original human genome, newly created, would not contain the mutations and genetic defects that would later make consanguineous marriages problematic. The deleterious effects of inbreeding are the result of the accumulation of harmful mutations over many generations, a factor that would not affect the immediate sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. The human population faced a similar challenge after the flood, when only 8 people survived. Again, population growth would have necessarily involved marriages between relatively close relatives in the immediate generations. When Cain set out to build a city, this suggests he had an expectation of significant population growth in his descendants. Indeed, in the following verses, the text quickly traces several generations of Cain's descendants, mentioning his son Enoch, his grandson Irad, and so on until the 7th generation. This rapid population growth would be consistent with multiple sons and daughters born in each generation, even though the narrative mentions only specific individuals, generally the firstborn or those relevant to the continuity of the story. A similar pattern can be observed in the genealogy of Seth, the son whom Eve recognized as a replacement for Abel. Seth's lineage is carefully traced because it eventually leads to Noah, and through him, to all post-flood humanity. However, even in this carefully documented lineage, the text frequently adds the phrase, "and he had other sons and daughters," after mentioning only one specific descendant. Another factor to consider is the nature of ancient historical writing, which frequently focused on patrilineal lineages, mentioning women only when absolutely necessary for the narrative. This practice would explain why Adam and Eve's daughters are not mentioned by name, despite their existence being confirmed in the text. The tendency to focus only on the essential elements of the narrative would also explain why the text doesn't pause to explicitly clarify the origin of Cain's wife. For the first recipients of these stories, accustomed to this literary style, the conclusion that she was a descendant of Adam and Eve would be obvious, not requiring additional explanation. Thus, although the text doesn't explicitly state Cain married his sister, all contextual indicators point to this conclusion as the most consistent with the biblical narrative as a whole. The true significance of the enigma of Cain's wife goes far beyond a simple genealogical curiosity. This apparent paradox invites us to reconsider our approach to ancient origin narratives and recognize the distinct purposes of these texts. A rarely discussed aspect of this mystery is that it perfectly illustrates the selective and focused nature of biblical narratives. The ancient authors weren't writing a complete and detailed history in the modern sense. They were recording a theological narrative focused on conveying specific truths about the relationship between the divine and humanity. Modern genealogists try to document every individual in a family lineage, but ancient writers followed a different principle. They mentioned only individuals directly relevant to the main narrative line. While we ask who was Cain's wife, the first hearers of these stories understood that the silence about her specific identity simply meant she wasn't central to the message being conveyed. Another surprising revelation comes from modern genetic studies. Contemporary science has discovered that human genetic diversity is remarkably small compared to other species, suggesting that our species went through one or more population bottlenecks, periods when the human population was reduced to a relatively small number of individuals. These findings are consistent with ancient narratives about common origins and events, like the flood described in the Bible. Anthropologists also highlight that almost all ancient cultures possess similar origin narratives, stories about an original couple or a small founding group of humanity. This cross-cultural convergence suggests possible collective memories of real events, preserved and transmitted through generations, albeit with specific cultural variations. A fascinating discovery from comparative linguistics is that human languages appear to diverge from common sources. Language families can be traced back to few ancestral languages. This pattern is consistent with the idea of common origins and subsequent dispersion, as described in biblical narratives. Scholars of ancient scriptures have identified that the account of Cain and his city represents more than a simple family story. It symbolically marks the beginning of human civilization, with its positive aspects, cultural development, and negative ones, potential for violence and injustice. In this context, the specific identity of Cain's wife is secondary to the role she plays in the larger narrative about the development of civilization. Archaeologists have found evidence that the first human civilizations did indeed arise in the region described as the cradle of humanity in biblical texts, the Fertile Crescent, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This convergence between archaeological records and ancient narratives adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of these stories. A little-known aspect is that ancient Jewish traditions had already contemplated this question centuries before it became a point of modern debate. Commentators like Rashi, 11th century, explained that Cain's wife was obviously one of his sisters, and that this conclusion was so evident to the original readers that it didn't need to be explicitly stated in the text. Contemporary scholars of narratology point out that silence about certain information in ancient texts frequently indicates not an accidental omission, but a deliberate choice to direct the reader's attention to elements considered more important. Thus, the problem of Cain's wife exists primarily for modern readers who expect a different type of narrative completeness. The consistent historical interpretation, from ancient times to recent commentators, is that Adam and Eve's sons and daughters married each other in the first generations, and that Cain's wife was his close relative. This conclusion is based not only on the biblical text itself, but on understanding the historical, cultural, and literary context in which these narratives were produced and transmitted. To discover more fascinating stories like this, just subscribe to the channel. Each episode explores the most intriguing and little-discussed aspects of biblical narratives, illuminating questions that many think about, but few have the courage to ask. The enigma of Cain's wife teaches us something profound about how to interpret ancient texts. The apparent gaps in the narrative aren't necessarily problems to be solved, but invitations to understand the specific purposes of the original authors and the contexts in which these stories were first told. This mystery also reminds us that origin narratives aren't intended to satisfy our curiosity about every historical detail, but to convey deeper truths about our nature, our relationships with one another, and our relationship with the divine. The enigma of Cain's wife transcends simple biblical curiosity and touches on fundamental questions that still resonate in our lives today. The search for answers to this mystery reflects our human need to understand our origins and find meaning in our collective existence. When we contemplate this ancient story, we're confronted with the same question that all generations have faced: where did we come from? This search for origins isn't exclusive to religious people or Bible scholars. It's a universal concern that transcends cultures and epochs. The silence of the biblical text on details we would consider crucial teaches us something about expectations and perspectives. Just as the ancient author didn't feel the need to explicitly state the origin of Cain's wife, we too often presume that our way of seeing the world is the only possible one, forgetting that other cultures and epochs may have priorities and concerns very different from our own. This narrative also connects us with questions of community identity. Just as all the first humans in the biblical narrative shared a common origin, we moderns, despite our cultural, ethnic, and national differences, also share a common humanity that unites us in a shared destiny on this small planet. The family tensions portrayed in the story of Cain and Abel, and the subsequent formation of a new community by Cain and his wife, mirror the challenges we face in our own relationships. Jealousy, competition, violence, and eventually redemption and reconstruction. These fundamental elements of human experience were already present in the first pages of history. Cain's movement away from his original family to establish his own path reflects the journey that many of us make in our lives, the necessary separation from our origins to create something new, even while carrying the marks of our past. The city that Cain built, the first mentioned in the scriptures, represents the human impulse to create civilization, to build something lasting. This same impulse moves us today when we develop technologies, build institutions, and create works of art that will survive beyond our individual lives.
When we ask about Cain's wife, we're really questioning how to read and interpret ancient texts in a modern world. This tension between past and present, between tradition and contemporaneity, defines many of the great debates of our time. Perhaps the deepest lesson from this enigma is about the nature of human narrative itself. No story tells everything. All narratives select, emphasize, and omit. Recognizing this helps us approach not only ancient texts but also the stories we tell about ourselves and our world today. In the end, the mystery of Cain's wife reminds us that all great stories leave room for questioning, interpretation, and continued exploration. The answers we find frequently generate new questions, keeping alive the dialogue between past and present, between text and reader. Humanity began as a family, according to this ancient narrative. And despite all the divisions and conflicts that have arisen since then, we continue, in a profound sense, to be connected to one another by invisible bonds of a shared heritage, not only genetic and historical, but also moral and spiritual. From the shadows of the first fratricide emerged a new community, a new chance, this capacity to begin again after tragedy, to build something new even while carrying the scars of the past, remains one of the most profound truths of human experience through the ages.